March 15th, 2007, Houston, Texas. Just after midnight, smoke began rising from the third floor of Building C in the Cypress Creek Apartments. At first, it looked like a small grill fire, but witnesses said the smoke was too dark, the smell too heavy, not plastic, not wood, something far worse. Firefighters found 2 barbecue grills burning red hot. No food, no sign of a party, just ash, thick, gray, and strangely oily. By dawn, the fire was out, but a 19-year-old college student named Grace Holloway had vanished. Her car still in the parking lot. Her phone, her purse, untouched. And on that balcony, the clues to one of Houston's most haunting cases were already cooling in the dark. What really burned that night in Cypress Creek? How does a young woman disappear without a trace, and a city decide her remains aren't worth finding? This is The Fire Without a Body, a true story inspired by real events. Stay with us to uncover the truth behind the smoke. Subscribe, turn on the bell icon, and never miss a case where every detail, every timeline, and every truth finally comes to light. March 15th, 2007, arrived in Houston the way most spring nights do, thick with humidity and silence, the air heavy with anticipation of summer. Cypress Creek Apartments, sprawled on the northwestern edge of the city, was the kind of place where nothing much happened. Students, single parents, couples barely getting by, retirees watching TV with the sound too loud. The buildings painted a bland beige, blended with the parking lots and leafless trees, a quiet corner of the world that didn't attract much attention. Until the night the smoke rose. It started just after midnight, a dark ribbon curling up from the third floor of Building C. At first, only a few residents noticed, mostly the insomniacs, someone pacing on a balcony, a tired woman in her kitchen washing the last glass of the day. The scent came next. Not the sharp tang of burning plastic, nor the woody smell of a kitchen fire, but something denser. It drifted into the hallways, pressed against the windows, set the air on edge. Within minutes, panic flickered through the complex. Phones lit up. 911 was dialed. "There's smoke coming from the balcony," a shaky voice told the operator. "It's not a normal fire. It smells wrong." When Houston Fire Department's engines pulled up, their red lights flashing against the stucco, most of the building's residents had already clustered outside. Pajamas, slippers, arms wrapped tight against the night. Some watched with blank curiosity, others with growing fear. The firefighters hustled up the stairwell, axes and hoses ready. But what they found was not the roaring inferno they expected. The flames were small, contained to a pair of barbecue grills perched against the far end of the balcony. Both were glowing, their coals burning a fierce red, thick ash spilling over the edges. The smoke, so black and oily, poured from their vents and vanished into the starless sky. One of the firefighters later described it as a heavy fire, not in size but in feeling. The smell clung to their gear, seeped into their lungs. It was the scent of fat and protein, something unnatural sizzling on open flame. Yet when they doused the grills, there was no sign of food, no sign of the cookout that might have explained it. Just gray, smoldering remains, hissing and fizzing as water hit hot metal. Down on the street, a few neighbors gathered closer, craning for a better view. That's when they noticed the man standing just inside the sliding glass door. He watched, arms folded, face blank, as if he'd been expecting all this. The alarms, the chaos, the sudden attention from people he rarely spoke to. He didn't ask questions, didn't move, just stood and stared as the firefighters worked, his eyes tracking the glow of the dying fire. The fire was out quickly. The building was deemed safe. By 2 a.m., most of the residents shuffled back inside. The crisis, whatever it was, apparently over. Yet something lingered. A neighbor, an older woman who never missed a thing, later said, "There was something about the way he stood there, like he was waiting for us to leave, like he didn't care if the place burned down." She shivered, recalling the acrid smoke that had settled in her hair. The following morning, the apartment complex buzzed with rumors. Some said the fire was an accident, maybe a drunk grilling late, maybe someone trying to get rid of old furniture. Others whispered about the smell, the way it lingered even after the windows were thrown open. Maintenance came by, checked the balcony, swept up the ashes. No official report was filed beyond unattended grill fire, but for the residents who had smelled that thick, bitter smoke, the explanation felt thin. Something had happened out there in the dark, something that didn't fit neatly into the routine of apartment life. No one noticed at first how the man who lived in 3C seemed unusually calm. He nodded at the maintenance crew, barely acknowledged the stares of his neighbors, and closed his blinds early that night. When a friend from downstairs asked if he was okay, he simply smiled and said, "Just a little barbecue gone wrong." But there were no invitations to join, no leftovers offered. Only silence broken by the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of tires on wet pavement. Life in Cypress Creek crept back to normal, or tried to. But the smell clung to the air for days, seeping into the curtains, lingering in the spaces between conversations. Some people avoided the third floor altogether. Others stared a little longer at the man in 3C when he walked to his car, wondering what had really happened on that balcony in the middle of the night. No one would know, not yet, that this was just the beginning, that the fire on the balcony wasn't the whole story, but a warning, a silent alarm that something terrible had already begun. Grace Holloway had always been the type of girl who tried to keep her world neat, organized, under control. Even as a little kid, she'd lined up her pencils by color, mapped out her homework in neat columns, and drawn elaborate bridges in the margins of her notebooks. Her mother sometimes joked that Grace's mind was made of blueprints. Every feeling, every hope, every fear carefully sketched out and measured, as if she could engineer her way through life. At 19, Grace was in her first year at Texas A&M, tucked away in College Station. She was the youngest in her civil engineering cohort, ambitious and tireless, working late in study rooms and picking up extra shifts at the library to make ends meet. Her professors noted her focus. Her friends admired her determination. Grace wanted to build things: bridges, overpasses, highways connecting people. She talked often about going back to Houston one day, using her degree to repair the city's aging roads, to give something back to the place that had raised her. The first semester away from home had been both a liberation and a challenge. Grace threw herself into her studies, pushing back the loneliness with problem sets and late-night group projects. Sometimes, though, the isolation crept in, especially when she saw other girls heading out for parties or talking about boyfriends back home. Grace had had her share of heartbreak already, though she tried to keep that part of her life sealed away. A memory packed in a box she never meant to open. Now, with spring break on the horizon, Grace was coming home for just 1 week. The break was supposed to be a breather, a chance to sleep in her own bed, eat her mother's cooking, and finish a scholarship essay she'd put off for too long. Her mother, Patricia, was thrilled, already planning dinners and shopping trips. Grace's old friends from high school had begun texting too, asking if she wanted to meet up at the Galleria or hit their favorite taco spot. Everyone seemed to expect the same Grace they'd always known. Calm, cheerful, steady as a metronome. But beneath the surface, Grace was anxious. There was another reason for her return to Houston, one she had not shared with anyone, not her mother, not her college friends, not even the roommate who sometimes noticed her staring at her phone with a worried frown. Grace had unfinished business in Houston, a thread from her past that refused to be cut. She'd told herself she was done with Colton Reese months ago. Their relationship had started with the kind of intensity that made everything else fade. Long drives down I-10, coffee at midnight, laughter in empty parking lots. But as the months wore on, Colton's charm faded, replaced by sharp words and cold silences. He became possessive, jealous, questioning every new friend she made, every night she stayed late on campus. Their arguments grew more frequent, their reconciliation less sincere. When Grace finally ended things, she did it by text, unable to face the weight of his disappointment in person. But Colton didn't let go. In the months after the breakup, his messages became insistent, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, always invasive. He sent her long emails in the middle of the night. He called from unknown numbers, left voicemails she deleted without listening. Once he even showed up outside her dorm at Texas A&M claiming he just wanted to talk, just needed closure. Grace blocked his number, changed her social media accounts, told herself he'd eventually move on. But he didn't. And now, with the break approaching, Grace found herself dreading the possibility of seeing him. The thought haunted her on the bus ride home, her mind flitting between excitement to see her mother and an undercurrent of dread she couldn't shake. The day Grace arrived back in Houston, the city was caught between seasons. A muggy March afternoon, sunlight filtering through bare branches. She stepped off the bus, duffel bag slung over her shoulder, and spotted her mother waiting in the parking lot, waving enthusiastically. For a moment, everything felt safe. Patricia enveloped her daughter in a hug, chattering about groceries, the cat, the neighbors. Grace smiled, let herself relax, promised silently not to worry about Colton, not here, not now. But late that night, after dinner and a movie, Grace sat on the edge of her bed, phone in hand. She scrolled through unread messages, most from friends. At the bottom of the list, one new number, no name, just a missed call. Grace's breath caught. She stared at the number for a long time before turning off her phone and slipping beneath the covers. Still, sleep would not come. The next day, she told her mother she needed to visit the university to check on her scholarship paperwork. Patricia offered to drive, but Grace insisted she'd be fine. She just wanted a little independence, she said. She left the house late in the morning, but instead of heading to campus, she found herself driving past the old apartment complex where Colton lived. She didn't stop, didn't call, just circled the block twice before driving on. She tried to convince herself she was being paranoid, but she could feel eyes on her, somewhere behind drawn curtains, watching, waiting. Grace never told anyone about the real reason she came home that spring. She never mentioned the mounting dread or the unfinished conversation she knew she had to have. In the safety of daylight, the city felt familiar, her old life close enough to touch. But when the sun dipped behind the buildings and shadows stretched across the streets, Grace couldn't escape the feeling that she was being pulled back into something she had tried so hard to leave behind. And somewhere, not far away, someone else was waiting for her. Someone who wasn't ready to let go. Colton Reese used to be the kind of man people noticed for all the right reasons. At 27, he'd once been considered handsome in a Texas sort of way. Broad shoulders, tousled brown hair, a smile that hinted at confidence without arrogance. But that was before the restlessness set in, before the long nights staring at the ceiling, before Grace Holloway. Now, when neighbors in the Cypress Creek apartments passed Colton in the hallway, they looked away. His eyes had grown hollow, his movements jittery. Even in the sweltering Houston spring, he pulled his jacket tight around him, as if trying to hold his life together by sheer force of will. 6 months earlier, he and Grace had broken up. The end had been sharp, abrupt, her voice trembling on the phone, her final message clear. She needed to move on. At first, Colton believed it was just a rough patch, the kind every couple weathered. He waited for the call, the apology, the chance to explain, but it never came. Instead, there was silence. Then, as weeks passed, a growing emptiness gnawed at him. He clung to the relics of their relationship, the concert tickets from that stormy night in Austin, the mug she'd left in his cabinet, the strands of hair tangled in his bedsheets. Each item a memory, each memory a wound that refused to heal. The more Grace drifted away, the tighter Colton's world closed in around him. He lost his job at the auto shop, stopped returning friends' calls, let his bills pile up. He spent hours scrolling through old messages, replaying voicemails, searching for clues that maybe, just maybe, she still cared. He drove past her mother's house, parked 2 streets over, and watched for glimpses of Grace in the yard. Once he sat outside Texas A&M staring at the crowds of students, hoping for a fleeting glimpse of her ponytail swinging in the wind. He convinced himself it was all harmless, just a man in love refusing to give up. But the line between love and obsession is thin, and Colton crossed it so quietly, so completely, that he barely noticed until he was far beyond the point of return. The night Grace arrived back in Houston, Colton's mind raced with possibilities. He heard from a mutual acquaintance that she was home for spring break. A rush of hope, sharp as electricity, jolted him into action. He paced his apartment, his palms sweating, his phone clutched in a death grip. Just one conversation, he told himself. That's all I need. Closure. But deep down, he wanted more. He wanted her to see him, to remember what they'd shared, to realize that no one else could love her like he did. That Thursday evening, Colton dialed her number again. For hours, he rehearsed what he would say, practicing apologies in the reflection of his bathroom mirror. When she finally answered, her voice was guarded, weary, but polite. He heard her breathing, imagined the soft lines of her face. "Grace, please. Just one more chance to talk. I can't let it end like this." Not with so much unsaid. There was a pause, a hesitation. Then finally she agreed. They would meet one last time to talk things through. Colton felt triumph mixed with dread. He cleaned his apartment, picking up clothes, wiping down the counters, fussing over the small details that might impress her. He lit a candle, opened a window to let the smoke drift away. Outside, the city's hum was distant, muffled by the heavy curtains he'd drawn tight. The hours crawled by, each minute sharpening his anxiety. He replayed every moment of their relationship, her laughter on Galveston Beach, the way she'd squeezed his hand during horror movies, the gentle way she'd said his name. He remembered their fights too, her accusations, his anger, the bruising words neither could take back. Still, He believed all could be forgiven if only she would listen. Grace arrived at his apartment just after sunset, her car pulling into the visitor's lot. Colton watched from the balcony, his hands trembling. When she knocked, he opened the door with practiced nonchalance. She stood there, uncertain, clutching her purse like a shield. Her eyes flicked across the room, noting the changes, the way the furniture had been rearranged, the nervous energy in the air. They talked, at first, about nothing. Classes, her mother, the scholarship she was working on. But the conversation soon twisted, like it always did, back to their relationship. Colton's voice wavered between pleading and anger. "Why did you leave?" he demanded. "Was it someone else? Was I never good enough?" Grace answered softly, tried to explain her need for space, her desire to focus on school. But every word seemed to wound him deeper, and the tension built, a storm gathering behind his eyes. Hours passed. Outside, the apartment complex drifted toward sleep, porch lights flickering off one by one. Inside, the argument intensified. Grace stood, intent on leaving, but Colton blocked the door. "Please, just stay a little longer," he begged. His desperation thickened the air, his fingers twitching at his sides. He promised to change, to get help, to be better. But Grace had heard it all before. Eventually, she relented, just long enough to calm him. She sank onto the couch, exhausted, watching the minute hand sweep across the clock. Finally, when she saw a chance, she rose to go. Colton's eyes darkened. He reached for her arm, his grip too tight. "Don't walk away from me," he whispered. For a moment, Grace saw not the man she'd loved, but a stranger haunted, desperate, lost. The next morning, Grace's mother called, but her phone rang unanswered. Her friends texted, got no reply. Her car sat untouched in the parking lot, silent witness to the last night anyone would see Grace Holloway alive. And inside apartment 3C, the secrets smoldered, waiting for morning to reveal what darkness had already claimed. By Sunday afternoon, the bright promise of spring break in Houston had soured for everyone who knew Grace Holloway. In the Holloway home, Patricia waited for her daughter to walk in, her nerves fraying with each passing hour. At first, she told herself that Grace was with friends from high school, maybe at the Galleria or a late-night movie. Patricia cleaned the kitchen twice, refolded the laundry, kept glancing at the phone, trying to push back the panic clawing at her chest. Across town, Grace's friends sent texts that went unread, tried calling, and got only the hollow ring of voicemail. Her roommate back at Texas A&M shrugged off the silence. She figured Grace was home, surrounded by family, too busy to check her phone. But as hours turned to days, a strange, cold certainty settled in the spaces Grace had left behind. It was Monday when Patricia finally let herself worry out loud. She called Grace's friends, one after another, her voice brittle but calm, asking if anyone had heard from her daughter. "No, Mrs. Holloway," they all said. "Last we saw her was Thursday. She said she'd text when she got home." That was the first crack. When Patricia checked the driveway, Grace's car was still parked in the shadow of the live oaks, right where it had been since Friday morning. Patricia circled it twice, touching the hood, peering inside. The windows were foggy with dust. The back seat was empty except for a duffel bag. When she popped the trunk, she found Grace's purse and phone, abandoned beneath a heap of receipts and textbooks. It didn't add up. Grace never left home without her phone. Never. She was too careful, too connected to let herself go dark for more than a few hours. That detail alone sent a chill down Patricia's spine. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tried to steady her breathing, and dialed 911. The police came quickly, not with sirens, but with quiet voices and measured steps. They walked through the house, took down notes, promised to check security cameras and canvass the area. Patricia handed over Grace's phone, her hands trembling as she explained how unlike her daughter this was, how reliable, how responsible Grace had always been. The officers listened, asked about friends, boyfriends, old conflicts. One question made Patricia pause. Did she have any trouble with anyone recently? There was a name she hadn't spoken aloud in months: Colton Reese. Patricia hesitated, then nodded. They broke up last fall. He took it hard. I thought it was over. The officers exchanged a look she couldn't read. Meanwhile, the detectives began their search at Cypress Creek Apartments. It was a sprawling complex, dozens of buildings identical as paper dolls. Grace's car was found parked outside Building C, untouched. No sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle. But the officers noticed small details: a set of keys left in the cup holder, a half-finished bottle of water in the console, a faded photograph of Grace and Colton tucked behind the visor. They knocked on doors, asking the neighbors if anyone had seen Grace. Most shook their heads, said they'd been out or asleep. But one neighbor, a retiree who tended her balcony plants with religious devotion, remembered something odd. The man in 3C, Colton, he was out there all night, grilling something. But it didn't smell like food. And he never looked at me, just kept tending those grills, like he was hypnotized by the fire. She wrinkled her nose. The smell was bitter, not like anything I'd ever smelled before. The detectives climbed the stairs to Colton's apartment. He answered the door almost immediately, looking disheveled but strangely calm. His eyes darted from face to face as they explained why they were there. "Grace?" he repeated, voice flat. "Yeah, she stopped by. We talked. She left hours ago. Haven't seen her since." His apartment was spotless, almost too much so. The air inside was sharp with the lingering sting of cleaning chemicals. On the balcony, the two barbecue grills sat cold, ash scattered on the tiles and smudged into the grout. One detective crouched down, running a finger through the dust. The ash was a strange color, and the faint, acrid smell clung stubbornly to the air. "Mind if we take a look around?" the officer asked. Colton shrugged, stepping aside. The detectives moved quietly, eyes taking in every detail. The too-clean bathroom, the windows left wide open, the faint traces of something once burned still clinging to the floor. But there was nothing obvious. No blood, no sign of violence. Only the uneasy feeling that something had happened here that refused to leave any easy answers. Back in the parking lot, the detectives compared notes. Grace's car, her phone, her purse, all left behind. No witnesses, no surveillance footage showing her leaving the building. Only a handful of neighbors who recalled the smell of burning, the restless figure of Colton tending his midnight fires, and the eerie silence that followed after. For Patricia, the days became a blur of worry and pleading. She called Grace's number every hour, leaving messages she knew her daughter would never hear. She pasted flyers on telephone poles, stood outside the apartment complex for hours, asking strangers if they'd seen her daughter. Each night she prayed, bargaining with whatever force might listen, begging for a sign, a message, a single word that Grace was okay. But Grace Holloway had gone silent, leaving behind only a car, a phone, and a city beginning to wake up to the fact that something terrible had happened in the shadows of their ordinary lives. And all the while, the faint, bitter smoke seemed to hang over Cypress Creek, a reminder that some secrets are slow to fade, and some silences last forever. By Tuesday morning, the search for Grace Holloway shifted from hope to dread. Flyers fluttered on every telephone pole along the busy Houston streets, Patricia's face raw with exhaustion as she pleaded for help on local news stations. The city was waking up to the story of the missing engineering student, her clean-cut smile and bright eyes now a haunting reminder of how quickly a life could vanish. At the Cypress Creek apartments, yellow police tape flapped in the muggy breeze, sealing off the third floor of Building C. Detectives moved with deliberate care, notebooks in hand, reviewing every scrap of information. They re-interviewed neighbors, tracing the web of events from the moment Grace's car appeared to the last time anyone heard her voice. The timeline was thin, but the gaps only made their suspicions heavier. The warrant for Colton Reese's apartment came through just after sunrise. Officers entered quietly, the hush inside the unit broken only by the soft squeak of latex gloves and the crackle of radios. They moved through the rooms, cataloging every detail. In the bathroom, their flashlights revealed a faint splatter, small reddish stains in the grout behind the toilet, barely visible but unmistakable in the harsh glare of forensic powder. Someone had scrubbed here, and scrubbed hard. But the evidence remained, stubborn as the memory of a scream. Out on the balcony, the detectives sifted through the ash collected in the grills. The remains were dense, oddly textured, gray-white flecks mixed with charred fragments. As one investigator brushed away the top layer, something caught in the mesh, a jagged, brittle chip, smaller than a fingernail but disturbingly shaped. Another found a curved piece that could have once been part of a jawbone. They worked in silence, passing each discovery to the crime scene technician, who cataloged and bagged each fragment with methodical dread. Colton Reese sat inside the small, bare living room, hands cuffed, eyes darting from the detectives to the floor and back again. His calm from the night before had dissolved into a thin mask of composure, a twitch at the corner of his mouth betraying the chaos roiling beneath. When asked about the blood in the bathroom, he shrugged, mumbled something about a cut while shaving. About the ash, he insisted it was from a weekend barbecue, just some old meat, gone bad. But the questions kept coming, each one closing the circle tighter. Where was Grace? Why hadn't she taken her phone, her purse? Why had he cleaned his apartment so thoroughly the day after she visited? Hours ticked by, and Colton's answers unraveled. In the stark, fluorescent-lit interrogation room, he faced two detectives, one silent, the other relentless, his voice rising and falling, never giving Colton room to breathe. They played recordings of Grace's mother sobbing, showed him the photographs of the bloodstains, the fragments pulled from the ash. With every denial, Colton's voice grew fainter, his gaze more unfocused. "You were the last one to see her," the detective said, laying out the facts in a low, flat voice. "Your apartment is clean, too clean. We found blood, Colton. We found bone. Where is Grace?" For nearly 12 hours, Colton held out, insisting he knew nothing, that Grace had left on her own. He stared at the clock, watched the hands crawl forward, sweat beading on his brow. He told the same story so many times it began to sound rehearsed, a tired script unraveling at the seams. Finally, as night crept back over Houston, something in him broke. It wasn't a scream or a sudden confession, but a collapse, a shudder as he buried his face in his hands and whispered, "I didn't mean to kill her. I just lost control." The detectives pressed closer, hope flickering in their eyes. "Tell us where she is, Colton. Let her family have peace." But he wouldn't look at them. He stared at the table, voice hollow. "You won't find her," he said, barely more than a breath. "There's nothing left to find." The words hung in the air, heavy as the smell of ash on his balcony. The police knew, even before the forensic results came back, that this was no longer a missing persons case, but something far darker. The hope that Grace might come home, dazed but alive, dissolved in the fluorescent light. The next day, the detectives told Patricia Holloway the truth. There would be no search party, no coordinated sweep of the city's creeks and woods. Grace's body was gone, reduced to fragments and dust, scattered before the dawn could break. Outside, the city moved on, the story slipping from headlines to hushed whispers. But for Grace's family, and the officers who had combed the ash for answers, the search that never truly began was a wound that would never close. Every barbecue grill on every balcony became a silent witness, a grim reminder of the night when hope was extinguished, and a girl's light vanished into smoke and silence. It was the confession no one wanted to hear, yet it came in cold, stumbling fragments as the detectives pressed Colton Reese in the windowless interview room. Every light in the building seemed too bright, each question a scalpel, peeling away the layers of denial until only the truth remained. An ugly, incomprehensible violence followed by a desperate, gruesome cover-up. Colton slumped in his chair, hands trembling as he stared at the floor, his voice barely a whisper. He spoke in broken sentences, first about an argument, how Grace said she was leaving for good, how she told him she didn't want him in her life anymore. He said her words hit him like a physical blow, something inside him snapping. The next moments blurred in his memory. Anger, panic, hands reaching for her. She fought him. He remembered the way her voice rose, the sharp crack of her purse falling to the floor. Then, suddenly, she stopped moving. The silence afterward was thicker than any scream. For a long time, Colton said, he sat on the floor, staring at Grace's still form, his mind clawing for a way out. He wept. He screamed into a pillow. He rocked back and forth, praying she would wake up, that this was all some nightmare. But the only answer was the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of life moving on, oblivious, beyond his apartment walls. Then, in the hours that followed, guilt and terror congealed into something far darker, a twisted logic that whispered he could make it all disappear. Colton described moving her body to the bathtub, his hands numb and clumsy, his thoughts racing. He remembered the way her hair clung to his shirt, the smell of her shampoo, the weight of what he'd done pressing him down until he could barely breathe. He told police how he left the apartment once the building quieted, driving to a late-night hardware store as if in a trance. He bought a saw and heavy-duty trash bags, avoiding the cashier's gaze. Back at the apartment, time warped, hours stretching into eternities as he moved through a nightmare with no end. He filled the tub, started the water, tried to drown out the voice screaming inside his own head. Colton recounted, his voice shaking, how he dismembered Grace's body, wrapping the pieces in plastic, scrubbing the tub and the bathroom floor in between bouts of nausea and terror. He claimed he worked through the night, frantic, every muscle burning with exhaustion and disgust. The sound of the saw, he said, was the worst part, sharp and final, echoing in his memory long after he turned off the bathroom fan. When dawn approached and the apartment building started to stir with early risers, Colton made his final, most chilling decision. He dragged the bags to the balcony, where the two barbecue grills stood waiting, blackened by old grease and the ghosts of countless forgotten meals. He poured lighter fluid, watching the flames leap up, yellow and hungry. Then, piece by piece, he fed what was left of Grace to the fire. The burning lasted all night. The smell, dense and foreign, curled through the air and drifted into the upper floors. Ash spilled over the edges, clinging to Colton's hands and arms, coating his lungs. He kept watch through the glass door, terrified someone would see, yet unable to stop. He tended the grills as if hypnotized, staring into the coals as they glowed and crackled, praying the flames would erase the evidence of what he had done. By morning, little was left but bone fragments and a heavy gray ash. Colton gathered the remains into garbage bags, tying them tight, his hands stained and shaking. He carried the bags to the complex dumpster just before sunrise, the air cool and silent, Houston's early traffic humming distantly in the background. He dropped them in, closed the lid, and walked away, barely able to stand. A garbage truck arrived before most of the residents even woke, swallowing the bags, crushing and compacting everything into the city's endless landfill. With the evidence disappearing into a mountain of waste, Colton tried to clean the apartment, scrubbing the bathroom again, mopping the floors, dumping bottles of bleach and ammonia down the drains. He changed his clothes, tossed out the saw and every cleaning supply he'd used, and finally collapsed on his couch, unable to cry, unable to sleep. The horror of what he'd done didn't fade in the harsh light of day. The smell lingered, clinging to the curtains and the grout between the tiles, a ghost haunting every corner. When detectives came to ask their questions, Colton tried to play calm, but the strain showed at every edge. His forced smile, his hollow eyes, the tremor in his voice as he insisted Grace had simply left. In the end, the evidence told its own story. Bloodstains in the bathroom grout, fragments of bone in the grill ash, neighbors who remembered the bitter smoke, and the man who spent all night watching the fire. There was no grave for Grace Holloway, no place for her mother to bring flowers or say goodbye. There was only silence, and a city forced to reckon with a crime that vanished its victim, leaving behind nothing but ash, lies, and unbearable questions. When the details of Colton Reese's confession broke, Houston held its breath. The headlines blared across television screens and news sites. Missing student's body burned, ashes dumped in landfill. What followed wasn't just horror, but a question that tore through every conversation and echoed across city council chambers and church pulpits. What now? What would justice look like for a family robbed not only of their daughter, but of the chance to bury her? Reporters camped outside Cypress Creek Apartments. News vans lined the curb, the smell of bitter smoke replaced by the hum of live broadcasts. Neighbors whispered on their balconies, reliving the memory of that night. The strange smell, the flickering flames, the way Colton stood motionless, watching the smoke rise. Patricia Holloway, her face gaunt with grief, appeared on camera, clutching Grace's senior yearbook photo to her chest. "All I want," she said, her voice trembling but strong, "is to lay my baby to rest. I want to bring her home." The Houston Police Department fielded hundreds of calls. Community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens demanded a full search of the city landfill. 40,000 tons of garbage, an ocean of refuse where by now Grace's ashes were scattered and buried. Some said the city owed it to Patricia, to every parent terrified by the news. "Wouldn't you want them to search if it was your child?" asked one pastor on local radio, his voice cracking. But the landfill was enormous, acres and acres of compacted waste, stretching like a man-made mountain beneath the punishing sun. City engineers explained the challenge on the nightly news. Even with the confession, even with a rough date and time, the odds of finding Grace's remains were almost non-existent. Each new load of garbage, each day's crush and shift, buried evidence deeper. The cost would be staggering, over $300,000, maybe more, with no promise of closure at the end. Behind closed doors, city officials and law enforcement debated for hours. The sheriff's office released a careful statement. "After consulting with forensic experts and evaluating the size and condition of the landfill, we have determined that the likelihood of recovery is extremely low. The resources required would be better used preventing future tragedies. Our hearts go out to the Holloway family, but at this time, we will not be conducting an excavation." The backlash was immediate and fierce. Talk radio filled with callers, some angry, some broken-hearted, some simply stunned that a girl could disappear so completely, so finally, in the middle of a modern American city. "She's not just trash," one woman sobbed into the microphone. "She was someone's daughter, someone's hope. How can you just leave her there?" Patricia Holloway refused to give up. She stood on the steps of City Hall, surrounded by news cameras, her grief now a public battle. "I just want to bury my child," she pleaded, her hands trembling around a faded photograph. Not a rumor, not a memory, a person, someone real. Her words were picked up by newspapers across the country, her pain amplified by every interview, every plea for mercy. People sent flowers and cards. Strangers stood outside the landfill gates holding candles and signs. "Bring Grace home." Yet the city did not yield. The decision was final. There would be no search. Instead, the district attorney's office promised swift prosecution, urging the public to focus on justice in the courtroom. The mayor's office quietly authorized counseling for the Holloway family, while privately, officials worried about setting a precedent they couldn't sustain. In the end, for all the noise, the landfill remained undisturbed, its secrets pressed deeper each day beneath the weight of the city's indifference. That week, the case became national news, morphing from a local tragedy into a broader conversation about justice, closure, and the limits of what society owes its victims. Cable news anchors debated the ethics of cost versus compassion. Victims' rights advocates held rallies in front of City Hall, candles flickering against the dusk, as they read out the names of women and girls lost to violence. Social media burned with outrage and grief, each post a digital vigil, a way of refusing to let Grace disappear entirely. For Patricia, the city's decision was more than a bureaucratic denial. It was another wound, a second theft. Every night, she set a place at the dinner table for her daughter. She kept Grace's room exactly as it had been, college books stacked neatly, the bridge drawings taped above her desk, her perfume uncapped on the dresser. Sometimes, late at night, Patricia would drive out to the edge of the landfill, parking on the shoulder with her headlights off, staring into the darkness where the earth swallowed her daughter's last trace. She whispered prayers into the wind, promising Grace she would never stop looking, never stop loving, no matter how much the world tried to forget. So the fire without a body became more than just a case. It became a question haunting every corner of Houston, every heart that feared what might be lost when justice and mercy no longer spoke the same language. And through it all, the memory of Grace Holloway flickered on, not just as a victim, but as the reason people kept asking, how could this happen? And what do we owe those left behind? By the time Colton Reese stood trial for the murder of Grace Holloway, autumn had settled over Houston, painting the city's sprawling suburbs in shades of brown and gray. It was October 2008, more than a year since the fire on that third-floor balcony. The memory of the case still hung heavy in the air, an unresolved ache, made sharper by the fact that Grace's body had never been found. The case had become a local legend, and as jury selection began, the courthouse overflowed with reporters, family members, and strangers drawn by both outrage and morbid curiosity. Inside, the courtroom felt less like a place of law and more like a theater. Every seat was filled. The jury, an anxious cross-section of Houston's working class, glanced nervously at the defendant. At the prosecution's table, Assistant District Attorney Lauren Nichols stacked her notes with methodical precision. Her eyes never left Colton, who sat stone-faced in a rumpled suit, hands trembling slightly as the bailiff called the court to order. Grace's mother, Patricia, was there every day, her presence a silent accusation. She sat in the front row, clutching her daughter's photograph, a small, battered oak leaf tucked inside as a makeshift bookmark. Every morning she whispered the same prayer, "Let today be the day they finally call this what it is: murder." Around her, supporters wore purple ribbons pinned to their jackets and blouses, a quiet signal of solidarity in a room full of strangers. The prosecution opened with the most chilling facts, painting Colton as a man obsessed with control, a man whose rage turned the ordinary into the unthinkable. They called expert after expert. Forensic technicians explained how blood seeps into grout, how bone fragments can survive even the hottest fire. The jury listened, eyes wide, as investigators described sifting through the barbecue grills, piecing together a story from the ash and dust Colton thought would erase everything. There was no body, but there was DNA. There was no grave, but there was testimony. Every word of Colton's confession, every call log and text, every grim artifact left behind. The defense, led by a weary public attorney, did what they could. They called Colton a man who had lost his temper, who acted in panic, who should be pitied, not condemned. They talked about his struggles with depression, his inability to move on, his desperate loneliness. Some days it almost seemed to work. But then the prosecution would return with the facts, the violence, the cover-up, the lies, and the spell would be broken again. Reporters scribbled every detail, their notes already forming headlines for the evening news. Social media buzzed with theories and outrage. People argued in bars and coffee shops. Was it justice to convict a man without a body? Could a confession, a handful of bone fragments, and a mountain of circumstantial evidence really be enough? But as the days wore on, the story shifted. It was no longer just about the absence of Grace's remains. It was about the presence of her memory and the determination of her mother to see her daughter's name cleared of rumor and speculation. In her testimony, Patricia's voice trembled but did not break. She spoke of Grace's childhood, her dreams, her kindness. She spoke of sleepless nights and unanswered prayers. She told the jury, I just want the world to remember who my daughter was. I want there to be some meaning to this pain." Her words lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. After hours of closing arguments, some fiery, some pleading, all urgent, the jury retired to deliberate. The city waited, breath held, hearts pounding. Night fell outside the courthouse, shadows stretching across the empty parking lot as the hours dragged on. Finally, just past midnight, the foreman returned with a folded slip of paper. "Guilty of first-degree murder." The words echoed through the room. Patricia covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks, as relief and grief mingled in her chest. Colton Reese sat motionless, eyes fixed on the floor, the weight of his actions finally crushing him in public as it had in private. The judge, voice steady, pronounced the sentence: 99 years in prison. There would be no parole, no mercy, no forgetting. The case made headlines across the nation, the fire without a body, not just because of its brutality, but because it forced people to reckon with the limits of justice. Even as the verdict was read, there was no body for Grace's mother to lay to rest, no headstone for friends to visit. Instead, Patricia planted a young oak tree near Grace's old high school, decorating it every March with flowers and ribbons. It became a place for memories, for mourning, and for hope. A living testament to a life taken too soon. Houston moved forward, but the trial left scars. For some, it was proof that justice, even when incomplete, could still be delivered. For others, it was a reminder that not all wounds can heal, not all questions have answers. But for Patricia Holloway, there was at least a measure of peace. Grace's story had been told. The truth, at last, had been named. And in that naming, Grace could finally, if not rest, then be remembered not for how she was lost, but for how fiercely she was loved. Long after the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded, the story of Grace Holloway continued to echo across Houston, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a window into a deeper, more painful truth. For all its twists and heartbreak, Grace's story was not just fiction. It was a mirror reflecting the real-life horror endured by another young woman, Tynesha Devonna Stewart. Tynesha's name haunted Houston long before "The Fire Without a Body" became a national headline. She was 19, just like Grace, a Texas A&M engineering student with her own dreams of building a better world. Those who knew her remembered her shy smile, her quick wit, her determination to break barriers that others said were too high. She loved her family fiercely. She studied hard. She carried hopes bigger than the city skyline. And like Grace, she was stalked by someone who once claimed to love her. In March of 2007, the Stewart family faced the same nightmare as the Holloways. Phone calls unanswered, hope slipping away with every passing hour. Tynesha's ex-boyfriend, Timothy Wayne Shepard, had always seemed quiet to those who met him. But his silence hid a possessive darkness that grew more dangerous each time Tynesha pulled away. When she finally ended things for good, Shepard's obsession curdled into rage. No one could have predicted how far he would go. On a nondescript Thursday evening, while the city busied itself with daily routines, Tynesha was lured to Shepard's apartment under the pretense of a final conversation. Within those walls, a familiar story played out. Anger, arguments, the desperate clinging of someone unable to let go. In a sudden, irreversible moment, Timothy strangled Tynesha, ending her life with his own hands. But the horror didn't end with her death. Consumed by panic and a twisted resolve to erase his crime, Shepard bought a saw, dismembered her body, and attempted to destroy the evidence in 2 barbecue grills on his apartment's balcony. All night, he fed the flames, smoke spiraling into the sky above the quiet apartment complex, a sinister signal that almost no one noticed for what it was. By morning, Tynesha's remains had been reduced to ash and fragments, swept into garbage bags and tossed into the communal dumpster, lost forever in the city's landfill. For Tynesha's family, the pain was unspeakable. Her mother pleaded for a search, begging authorities to dig through 40,000 tons of refuse so her daughter might be returned home so there could be a funeral, a headstone, a proper goodbye. But the city said no, citing the enormous cost, the tiny odds of success, the sheer magnitude of the landfill. They offered sympathy, but not closure. Tynesha's family was left with only memories, haunted by the knowledge that their daughter's final resting place was somewhere deep beneath the city's discarded waste. The decision not to search the landfill sparked outrage and debate far beyond Houston. Talk shows, newspapers, and community leaders all wrestled with the same uncomfortable question. What should be the measure of justice when there's nothing left to find? How much effort, how many resources should a city spend to honor its dead? Is the cost of hope ever too high? For many, the answer was simple. There is no cost too great when it comes to bringing a loved one home. Tynesha's story galvanized a movement, shining a harsh light on the dangers of domestic violence and the failures of systems meant to protect. Vigils were held, fundraisers organized, and her name became a rallying cry for survivors and advocates alike. In churches and living rooms, people repeated her story, refusing to let her be forgotten. The tragedy forced an entire city to confront hard truths about control, jealousy, and the silent escalation of violence in relationships. Experts spoke on TV about red flags and warning signs, about the need for friends and family to step in before it was too late. Counselors visited schools, offering resources and support to young women who saw pieces of themselves in Tynesha's life, and heartbreakingly, in her death. In October 2008, after months of legal maneuvering and heartache, Timothy Wayne Shepard was convicted of murder and sentenced to 99 years in prison. Yet for Tynesha's loved ones, the verdict could not bring her home. There was no grave to tend, no marker to visit on anniversaries or birthdays. Instead, her legacy became the determination of her community to ensure her story would not be lost to the landfill or to time. To this day, Tynesha Devonna Stewart's name is spoken in Houston and far beyond, not as just another victim, but as a symbol. She stands for all those lost to violence, for the countless women whose lives are stolen by those who claim to love them, for the families left behind to mourn in silence. Her story lives on as a warning, a memory, and a call to action, that no one should ever disappear into smoke and bureaucracy, that love should never end in fear, and that justice, though often imperfect, must always strive to remember those it failed to save. And so, through stories like Grace's and Tynesha's, the world remembers, and remembering, refuses to let the flames of loss erase the light these young women brought to the world. In the months and years that followed, the story of Tynesha Devonna Stewart and her fictional counterpart, Grace Holloway, became more than just a crime to be solved or a tragedy to be mourned. It became a lesson echoing through Houston and far beyond, reshaping the way a city thought about love, loss, and what we owe each other in the darkest moments. For Tynesha's mother, every day was a new negotiation with absence. There was no grave to visit, no quiet place where memories could settle. Each spring, she found herself standing beneath the young oak tree planted in her daughter's memory, hands trembling as she tied fresh ribbons and left bouquets at the base. She watched as strangers stopped to read the small plaque, in memory of Tynesha Devonna Stewart, beloved daughter, lost but never forgotten, and felt both pride and heartbreak. Tynesha's life had become a symbol, but her laughter, her dreams, her presence at the breakfast table, all those were gone, irretrievable as smoke. Yet in the wake of such profound loss, something unexpected began to grow. Tynesha's name, and the story of Grace Holloway, whose fictional pain mirrored so much real suffering, sparked conversations in classrooms, churches, and city council meetings. Parents sat down with their daughters and sons, talking openly about the warning signs of unhealthy love, control disguised as caring, jealousy that sharpens into anger, the slow erosion of confidence beneath the weight of another's need. School counselors found themselves fielding more questions from students, sometimes awkward, sometimes urgent, always important. Young women and men learned that true love never thrives in silence or secrecy, that anyone who tries to isolate you, frighten you, or make you feel less than whole is not acting out of love, but control. Friends began to check in on one another with more sincerity, asking not just about grades or plans for the weekend, but about how relationships felt deep down when no one else was looking. Local organizations saw a rise in calls for help, some tentative, some desperate. Volunteers at the National Domestic Violence Hotline, whose number had been shared again and again during news coverage of the case, worked tirelessly to offer resources, support, and hope. Survivors spoke out, sharing stories of close calls and narrow escapes, grateful for the warning they had seen in Tynesha's fate. For every call that ended in safety, a small victory was won against the silence that so often lets violence take root. But the most important change came in the way the community remembered. People no longer allowed the details of the fire, the horror of what had been lost, to define Tynesha or Grace. Instead, they spoke of possibility, the bridges Grace might have built, the dreams Tynesha carried for her family, the laughter that once filled ordinary days. School scholarships were founded in their names, supporting young women entering engineering, social work, and law. Fields where hope could be built, justice shaped, and protection strengthened. On anniversaries, local newspapers ran op-eds, not just about the crime, but about the lessons it taught. The city's leaders committed new funding for domestic violence prevention and support, vowing not to let another victim slip through the cracks. People were reminded that evil often hides behind ordinary doors, that prevention is the work of neighbors and friends as much as police and courts. In telling Tynesha's story and Grace's, it became clear that the retelling was not about sensationalism or reopening wounds, but about refusing to let pain become invisible. Each time someone spoke their names, it was a refusal to let the world forget. It was a commitment to a future where no one's last trace is left in the ashes, where every voice matters, and every loss is answered with action. And so this story, The Fire Without a Body, ends with a lesson, not a moral. It is not enough to grieve. We must act. If someone in your life tries to control you, isolate you, or make you afraid, know that you deserve better. Love should never hurt. Tell someone. Reach out. Trust that your safety and happiness matter, even when the world seems indifferent. If you or someone you know needs help, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is always open. 1-800-799-7233. Calls are free, confidential, and can be the first step toward a safer, brighter tomorrow. Tynesha's story ended in fire, but her light endures, carried by her family, her friends, and everyone who says her name out loud. Grace Holloway's story, though imagined, draws from this same well of hope and heartbreak. These stories exist not to frighten, but to teach, to honor, and to change what comes next. And if you believe that every victim deserves to be remembered, and every story deserves to be told, subscribe, turn on the bell icon, and stay with us for more true stories that matter. Because every case we share is one step closer to justice, and every voice that listens brings us closer to hope.